So this is the second part of our lecture on the Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire. And in the previous part, we talked about, we had a little introduction about the nature of thinking about this as a dark age and why in fact, it's the Carolingian Empire itself that makes this term dark age really problematic and indeed wrong as a way to describe this era. We also talked about the origins of the Carolingian dynasty with Charles Martel and his son Pepin the Short, who was the father of Charlemagne. So we've left off with Pepin's death and the reunification of the kingdom under Charlemagne in 771. Charles's list of accomplishments over the course of his nearly 50 years in power, he died in 814, remains truly impressive, and it makes him well deserving of the title the Great that he was given even in his own lifetime. Remember, in Latin he was Carolus Magnus, and that's where we get our term Carolingians, but it's also where we get the modern French term Charlemagne. Charles was more than just a conqueror. He was an able ruler with a vision of a united Latin Christian civilization in Western Europe that required improved administration and education to bring his conquest together. And he lived long enough to see many of these changes, if not completely carried out, at least established as an ideal. Despite how much we know about Charlemagne's reign, he himself remains a difficult figure to come to grips with, and scholars debate endlessly what he was really like behind all the propaganda. His own biographer clearly bought into the carefully crafted legend. And one example of this is this statue, supposedly often attributed to be Charlemagne on the left. Most modern scholars now believe that it was actually of one of his grandsons, but you still see it used in a lot of images of Charlemagne. On the right is a coin depicting Charlemagne, and you'll notice that he has deliberately modeled himself as a Roman emperor. That is his precedent that he is looking back to. The legitimacy all around the Mediterranean, in every region that was formerly under Roman control and beyond, is still the ideal of Rome. We should note some of Charlemagne's effective conquests. Charles was not himself a terribly competent general, but he knew how to delegate, just as Augustus had. For almost the entirety of his reign, Charles waged war in particular against the Saxons, a tribe of Germans in Germany related to some of the groups that had ended up settling in England. And that these Germans, these Saxons, had never migrated into Roman territory, and they had remained pagan polytheists. These wars between Charlemagne and the Saxons were brutal, with Charles violently forcing the Saxons to convert to Christianity. But as soon as he left, the Saxons would rebel, they would slaughter the missionaries, that would prompt Charles to come back and slaughter the Saxons again in turn. And this went on backwards and forwards for 30 years. It was not, Saxony wasn't fully conquered until almost the very end of Charlemagne's reign in 804. And I want you to think about this for a moment in comparison to the Islamic conquests. Both were violent. But Charles, unlike the Muslim caliphs, was determined that everywhere that non-Christians he conquered would convert to Christianity. We saw this was the opposite of the Muslim attitude towards conquest during the initial Arab invasions. In the process of conquering Saxony, Charles expanded his territory well beyond the old borders of the Roman Empire, what Augustus had notably failed to do because of the Teutoburg forest disaster we looked at earlier. And thus, Charles really begins the process of expanding urban Christian society, and urban here is not terribly urban, but still the idea of towns, organized settlements, and Christian society into Central Europe that would continue down to the end of the Middle Ages. This is really going to be the beginning of most of what we would today call Germany, Poland, and so forth. As a slow process of moving outwards, this Frankish and Carolingian evolution of the old Roman urban culture, starting with Saxony. But Charles also conquered other smaller barbarian kingdoms. There was a small kingdom of Bavaria, most notably. And the most important of these was the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy that had ruined Justinian's goal of retaking the peninsula and who had long been a threat to the papacy in Rome. Charles also defeated the Lombards and declared himself king of the Lombards. Charles also expanded into other border regions, most famously crossing into Spain, or what we now think of as Spain. His initial foray was a disaster. and it led to a defeat that was much later mythologized in the epic Song of Roland, although because the Song of Roland, as it survives down to us today, was written down in the time of the First Crusade, the actual aggressors that had led to the destruction of Charlemagne's rearguard actions, these partisans or guerrilla warriors that kill Count Roland, were originally Christian Basques, but because when the Song of Roland was written down, the Crusades were going on, they are replaced in the story we have today with Muslims. But Charles did eventually return and conquered Catalonia and its chief city of Barcelona. And that's part of why the region remains a little bit culturally distinct from the rest of Spain down to this day. And as those of you who follow the news know, Catalonia and its capital of Barcelona are still involved with sort of establishing themselves as a little bit independent from the rest of Spain. There's an independence crisis going on there to some degree. Now, the most famous moment in Charles's reign came towards its end, on Christmas Day in the year 800 CE, one of the easiest to remember dates in all of medieval history, when Charles was crowned emperor by the Pope in the city of Rome, supposedly refounding the Western Roman Empire. And people have been arguing about what exactly was going on ever since. As you can see here, these are two much later medieval illustrations of Charlemagne being crowned. We don't have any contemporary illustrations that I'm aware of. Why was Charles in Rome? Well, he had actually shown up to help out a pope who had been chased out of the city by its own Roman citizens. So a very unpopular pope politically. Charles reinstalled the pope and had the pope's name officially cleared of the various crimes he had been accused of by his citizens. Why did Charles do this? Because Carolingian authority rested on papal authority ever since Pepin had used papal authority as a booster to his legitimacy in overthrowing the Merovingians. So Charles was somewhat obligated to do this if he wanted his dynasty's legitimacy to continue. But Charlemagne's Charles's biographer claims that the coronation was a surprise by the Pope shortly thereafter, and that has always led me to the hilarious image of the Pope sneaking up on Charles and popping a crown on his head while he's, I don't know, somehow down on his knees praying. I always want it to be a very Looney Tunes moment with maybe the Pope being Bugs Bunny. This is almost certainly untrue in the bluntest of terms, but it may not be wrong in its implications. Charles may not have wanted the Pope to be the one to crown him emperor, because it symbolically put his title of emperor under the authority of the popes, just as it had for Pepin to be crowned king. Crowning himself emperor would have given Charles an out from needing the popes. And when you think about it, no Roman emperor previously had ever needed a pope to crown him. Constantine hadn't been emperor because he was crowned by a pope, nor had any of Constantine's late Roman heirs. The Byzantine emperors were not, at least at this point, crowned by patriarchs in Constantinople. This was not a religious ceremony. So this was clearly an innovation on the part of this pope, and a clear attempt to symbolically claim authority to some degree over Charlemagne. We can perhaps see some indication of this in Charlemagne's later decision to crown his own son and successor, more on him in a moment, emperor himself without the pope. Although this man, his son, Louis the Pious, true to his epithet, that is his nickname, the Pious, later had a papal coronation after Dad died, somewhat undercutting Charlemagne's attempt to reassert imperial authority over the popes. Whatever the immediate intention of this pope, it had little practical significance in the short term. No pope ever told Charles what to do. They needed him too much and he was too powerful. But this coronation of Charlemagne in 800 had long-term implications for the relationship of popes and emperors in the West, as we shall see, and to some degree the relationship between the popes, and that is the church more broadly, and all monarchs in Western Europe. Regardless, the Byzantines did not like this at all. They still thought of themselves as the only Roman emperors. Charles had a very strained relationship with Constantinople, but they were far enough removed from each other that this wasn't an immediate problem. Actually, if we're comparing relative empires, I should note that Charles claimed to have excellent relations with his exact contemporary, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid that we looked at in our last lecture, who apparently sent Charles a number of gifts, including an elephant. I always feel so sorry for this poor elephant who has to go live in northern Germany in the cold. Tellingly of their relative power levels, despite Charles's biographer and other historians going into great detail about this relationship back and forth with Harun al-Rashid, we have no record of Charlemagne from the Abbasid court at all. Modern historians have long called this revived Western Empire the Holy Roman Empire, but no one at the time called it that, or for centuries thereafter. This title, however, does capture the essential ingredients. This was an empire that was explicitly and ideologically Christian. We're going to see more on that in part 3 of this lecture. It intentionally recalled also the idea of the old Roman Empire. Notably, further emperors were only technically emperors of the Romans. Charlemagne had himself made emperor of the Romans. But these further Roman emperors, these Holy Roman Emperors as we often call them today, retained their other title of King of the Franks, or later King of the Germans, as well as other titles like King of the Lombards. This is an empire with multiple kingdoms and polities stitched together underneath the overall authority of the title Emperor of the Romans. Before we get into Charles's cultural accomplishments in part 3, I want to discuss the failure of his dynasty after him. Fundamentally, it came down to the same problem the Merovingians had: too many sons. Despite having a notion of a unified empire, fundamentally the Frankish nobility could not yet accept the idea of passing the whole state on to just one son if there were other options. Charles was actually all set up to break up his empire, but only one of his sons lived long enough to succeed him, Louis the Pious, and so this problem was deferred, put off for a whole generation. And Louis continued many of his father's policies. He indeed deserves some credit for continuing the impressive cultural projects of the empire for another 35 years. He basically gave this Carolingian project the time that it needed of coherent political backing to really set in terms that we'll be talking about later. But Louis did have too many sons, too many who did outlast him. In fact, they didn't even wait for Louis to die, but began rebelling in order to assert their claims to parts of the empire even before Louis's death, demonstrating how weak Louis was as a ruler. He's briefly even imprisoned by his sons. Full-scale civil war broke out between the 3 grandsons of Charlemagne, the sons of Louis the Pious, when Louis died in 840. The 2 younger brothers ended up ganging up on the eldest, who had already claimed the title of emperor, and they agreed to split the empire 3 ways at the Treaty of Verdun in 843. While their descendants spent the rest of the 800s fighting each other to try and put this kingdom back together, this empire back together, the basic division remained and formed the foundation of what would later become France, Germany, and all the stuff in between France and Germany that these 2 states were going to spend the next millennium fighting over, in some ways right down to the end of World War II. So that is the political breakup of the Carolingian Empire, but as I've tried to emphasize on several occasions, it's going to have a much longer cultural legacy, which is what we're going to look at in part 3.